In August 1649, a fleet of over 100 ships, loaded with men, weapons and supplies, landed at Ringsend on the outskirts of Dublin.
Sword of the Lord!
It was one of the most powerful invasion forces England had ever assembled. Within 4 years, as many as 500,000 people, or 25% of the population of Ireland, would be dead. Proportionally, it was a worse disaster than the Great Famine of the 19th century. At the head of this force, known as the New Model Army, was Oliver Cromwell. To this day, Cromwell remains a dark silhouette against the blood-stained backdrop of Irish history. He stands accused of war crimes, religious persecution, and ethnic cleansing on a dramatic scale. The English writer G.K. Chesterton said of Cromwell's conquest of Ireland that it was a tragic necessity that the Irish should remember it, but far more tragic that the English forgot it.
The human cost was enormous. Between 1/5 and 1/4 of the civilian population perished in the years 1649, 50, 51, 52 and into 53. That is Cromwell's legacy.
It's part of a cycle of violence, but the escalation of that cycle of violence has to be the biggest single reason why there has been problems between the communities here and between the islands of Britain and Ireland ever since.
Cromwell inadvertently played a key role in the development of modern Irish nationalism, as the shared experience of violent persecution and dispossession forged a sense of common identity among the Catholic peoples of Ireland. So who was this man? Why had he come? And what is the truth behind one of the most harrowing and controversial episodes in Irish history?
We are come to ask an account of the innocent blood that hath been shed. We come to break the power of a company of lawless rebels. We come, by the assistance of God, to hold forth and to maintain the lustre and glory of English liberty in a nation where we have an undoubted right to it!
Ireland, 400 years ago, a divided and troubled country. Since the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169, the native Irish had resisted successive attempts by the English crown to control the island. The defeat of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 signalled the end of the old Gaelic political order. Queen Elizabeth's successor, James I, now adopted a radical policy that would dramatically alter the course of Irish history: the Ulster Plantation. Tens of thousands of English and Scottish Protestants migrated across the Irish Sea to Ulster, settling on lands that had previously been inhabited by native Irish Catholics. The descendants of the original Anglo-Norman settlers were known as the Old English. Like the native Irish, they had remained true to the Catholic faith. Both groups were determined to resist the English government's efforts to impose the Protestant religion.
Is dordige dalav de has le tiadav de queer Saxonig liabig nangoil lam is transplantation chach le hele.
But how could such an extensive policy of colonization be justified? In the early 17th century, the English began to expand their territories across the globe, in North America, the Caribbean, and India. In many ways, Ireland acted as a laboratory for empire, enabling the English to test out new policies closer to home before exporting them overseas.
The whole process of civilizing Ireland was complicated. On one hand, it involved the use of force, sheer military power to overcome and subdue Ireland. On the other, it involves exposing Irish people to English customs, habits, language, legal practices, and, of course, the Protestant religion.
Elizabeth's successor, King James, may well have hoped for the peaceful acceptance of his civilising mission by the native population. But colonial officials on the ground favoured a policy of discrimination and dispossession, which in turn provoked resentment and resistance. The English identity was increasingly associated with the Protestant faith, and Irishness with Catholicism. The resulting ethnic and religious tensions threatened to tear the country apart. In 1625, James I died and was succeeded by his son, Charles I, who insisted on political and religious conformity throughout the three Stuart kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. His policies triggered a revolt by Scottish Presbyterians in the late 1630s. The success of the Scots inspired Irish Catholics to make plans for their own rebellion. On the 22nd of October 1641, Sir Phelim O'Neill, the leading O'Neill still resident in Ireland, seized Charlemont Fort in County Armagh. Before long, he controlled most of South Ulster. It soon became clear, however, that Sir Phelim O'Neill could not control his followers. As law and order collapsed across the kingdom, the Irish Catholic population seized the opportunity to settle old scores. Protestants were attacked, robbed, and driven from their homes, which in turn provoked vicious and indiscriminate reprisals from government forces.
Get out! Get out! Whoa, get out! Get out, Archbishop! Leo!
Soon there was a downward spiral into violence and massacre. In the coming months, thousands would be killed. One of the most notorious massacres took place at Portadown in County Armagh, where over 100 Protestants were killed. The captives were driven 6 miles through the countryside until they reached the River Bann.
The prisoners were driven into the water. And then and there were instantly and most barbarously drowned. And those that could swim and came to the shore, they knocked on the head, and so after drowned them. Or else they were shot to death in the water.
Elizabeth's 5 children were among the slain. Not long afterwards, she witnessed a strange apparition at the site of the massacre.
There appeared a vision or a spirit, assuming the shape of a woman, standing upright in the water, waist high, her hair disheveled, very white, her eyes seeming to twinkle in her head, and her skin as white as snow. This woman or vision divulged and often repeated the word revenge. Revenge. Revenge.
When news of the rebellion reached England, the call for revenge was repeated.
Well, the Irish Rebellion of 41 is one of the most traumatic events recorded in the history of Britain and Ireland. It's probably the biggest civilian massacre in the history of these islands, the whole archipelago. Probably 3,000 to 8,000 civilians are killed. But by the time the story reaches England, it's 100,000 civilians have been killed. Nothing like it's ever been recorded, ever known. It's completely unprecedented. And so it brings to Britain a reported scale of atrocity that's only otherwise known in Europe. And until now, we regard the British Isles as being shielded from just that kind of scale of horror and violence. And so the English feel as though something they've known as a nightmare from abroad is now on the edge of their shores and is coming their way.
English propagandists published lurid and exaggerated accounts of the rebellion that bore little resemblance to reality.
We need to realise that 1641 is the first year in which there is a free popular press. There is, in effect, newspapers. There are pamphlets pouring out which purport to be eyewitness accounts. There are woodcuts of grotesque violence, which are more shocking than anything we'd see on our television screens nowadays. And the sheer novelty as well as the sheer horror of this gives an overwhelming sense that there's been one of the great atrocities of Western history taking place just over the Irish Sea.
They reported as many as 150,000 deaths. In fact, about 4,000 Protestants had been killed, and a further 8,000 died after being driven into the wilds in harsh winter conditions. The English may well have been shocked by reports of massacres, but the Irish had long and bitter experience of colonial violence. And not surprisingly, propagandists in London ignored the fact that thousands of innocent Catholics were killed by government troops during the early months of the rebellion. Like all Englishmen, Oliver Cromwell was horrified by reports of the 1641 rebellion. A burning desire to avenge the massacre of Protestant settlers provided the key motivation for his subsequent invasion of Ireland. An obscure landowner from the reclaimed marshlands of the Fens in East Anglia, Cromwell was extremely well connected through his extended family network.
Cromwell comes from the top 3% of English society, but he sinks to near the bottom of that 3%. He's born with a fat silver spoon in his mouth, stuck there by a rich uncle. But when Oliver's in his 20s, uncle goes bust, and Oliver is broken socially, and has to go and live as a working tenant farmer in the countryside, which counts as massive humiliation. We know that Cromwell's in trouble emotionally. In the late 1620s, he goes to a famous doctor in London to be treated for acute nervous depression. And so you get some idea of somebody who is deeply melancholy, confused, feeling wretched. This is a ripe mental field for sowing with new ideas, because one of the points of being born again as a Puritan in England is you get the idea that God has thrown you down in order to discipline you, just to raise you up for a great purpose.
You know what my manner of life hath been. Oh, I have lived in and loved darkness, and hated the light. I was a chief of sinners. This is true. I hated godliness. Yet God had mercy on me.
When he has a big religious conversion experience in the 1630s, he says, I must serve my God either by doing or by suffering. And I think he feels initially that he's called to witness to the God who has saved him by suffering. But once the opportunity comes, once he, against all the odds, becomes an MP, serves in Parliament, he realises that God has called him not to serve by suffering, by doing. And from that moment onwards, he is absolutely convinced that he has been called to be the instrument of God's purposes. As a politician, he is seen as very headstrong. He isn't a learned man. The only book he ever cites in the whole of his hundreds of letters and dozens of speeches, the only book he ever cites is the Bible, and he cites it repeatedly. He obviously knows huge parts of it off by heart, but he isn't a bookish man, and therefore when he speaks in Parliament, the more sophisticated, learned people around see him as being a rather raw, unsophisticated man.
Although preoccupied for the next few years with English politics, the unfinished business of Ireland was never far from his mind. When God raised his hand in vengeance to punish the Irish rebels, Cromwell would be there. While the rebellion of 1641 was to prove decisive in Cromwell's relationship with Ireland, it also acted as a clarion call for many of Ireland's Catholic exiles. 1642 saw the return to Ireland of the great general Eoin Roe O'Neill, along with 300 experienced officers. These returning exiles were the rock on which native Irish hopes would stand or fall.
Ní amháin ghuiil an tíorsa go súile fásach ach tá sí go súile hifrean, dá bhéad bhí ifrean bheith ar an dailsa. Ar an dá héal, ní a bhain ach losca rúbáil gan trócaire agus cruálteachtaí atá cotíanta ag múraigh agus arabaigh.
Eoin Roe's task would not be an easy one. But then, fate dealt the Irish a lucky hand. In England, tensions between king and parliament erupted. Charles I had instigated a period of personal rule during the 1630s, creating deep divisions throughout England.
Without a rebellion in Ireland at the end of 1641, you'd have had a great deal of political tension in England, but it would have been talked out, and it was being talked out slowly. What the Irish rebellion does is produce an acute short-term crisis. It's not just that you have people now convinced that the world is falling to pieces around them, prepared to jump at every shadow and every cock crow. It's that you have an urgent military need to raise a big army and send it to Ireland, raising the critical question of who controls that army in England, and what they might do with it once the Irish are crushed.
The Irish Rebellion lit the fuse for the English Civil War, one of the most divisive and destructive conflicts in the history of these isles.
Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. My goodness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I trust, who subdueth my people under me.
Since the outbreak of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell had risen rapidly through the ranks of the parliamentary army. Even though he had no formal military training, Cromwell thrived in wartime, where he excelled as a leader of men.
Well, he clearly is an exceptional soldier, and he's an exceptional leader. And he seems to always communicate to his men that they are doing God's will, that he, as it were, has been told by God what needs doing, and if they follow him, they will succeed. And because they believe him, they do succeed. I mean, he is just an extraordinary leader of men.
Cromwell wanted an army unrestricted by local ties and staffed by highly disciplined, well-trained and suitably God-fearing men. He also preferred soldiers devoted, like himself, to Puritan ideals. The new model army had gradually developed into one of the most formidable, zealous and effective fighting machines in English history. Fighting between king and parliament prevented the English from intervening decisively in Ireland, where the Catholic forces made major gains. They established the Confederate Association, effectively a self-governing state, with its capital in Kilkenny, which controlled most of the country. The Confederates faced three separate enemies. The Royalists, under the command of a local Protestant, James Butler, Marquess of Ormond, the King's representative in Ireland. Protestant forces in Cork, loyal to the English Parliament, and finally, a Scottish army sent to Ulster to protect the settler community. For the next 7 years, the Confederates fought all three for control of Ireland. By 1646, Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians had won the English Civil War. The cost? Over 80,000 soldiers had died in battle, while Cromwell's own son, also called Oliver, died in parliamentary service. Negotiations between King and Parliament failed to reach a settlement, and when, in 1648, Royalists renewed the war, Cromwell and his supporters decided to take drastic action against this man of blood. Their decision turned the world upside down. After a brief show trial in January 1649, Charles I was executed at Whitehall in London. Shortly afterwards, the institution of monarchy was formally abolished and replaced by the Commonwealth of England, 140 years before the guillotines of the French Revolution would start to fall. Throughout England, there was a genuine outrage at what Parliament had done. And so, not for the last time, a government under threat at home decided to wage war abroad. An overseas campaign would rally English nationalist sentiment, and what better target than the hated Irish Catholics? There were other more practical reasons for an invasion. The seizure of Catholic-owned land would enable the Parliament to pay off its soldiers, as well as those London merchants who had financed the war. What followed was one of the largest land grabs in early modern European history.
It's now obvious that the enemies of Charles I in England stop at nothing.
In total, 12,000 soldiers disembarked with the largest train of siege artillery ever seen in the country. Cromwell could at last begin the reconquest of Ireland. Cromwell clearly shared the English sense of superiority over the Catholic Irish, and he quickly rallied the local Protestant population to his side.
All whose heart's affections are real for the carrying on of the great work against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish, for the propagating of the gospel of Christ, establishing peace and truth, and restoring this bleeding nation to its former happiness and tranquility, shall find favour and protection from the Parliament of England.
Catholic rebels could expect no mercy, but he assured the common folk that they would not be harmed. In fact, he hanged a number of his own troops for pillaging. At first, Cromwell enjoyed some success in this battle for hearts and minds. But within weeks, his relationship with the local Catholic population turned sour as a result of one of the most controversial episodes in Irish history. Drogheda, the nearest royalist garrison, was only 30 miles from Dublin. Ormond and his commanders took the fateful decision to defend the town, hoping to stall the parliamentary advance long enough to regroup the shattered royalist forces.
Sir, having brought the army belonging to the Parliament of England before this place to reduce it to obedience, I intend to the end the effusion of blood shall be prevented.
I thought fit to summon you to deliver the same into my hands to their use. If this be refused, you have no cause to blame me.
I expect your answer. And rest.
Your servant.
The governor of Drogheda, Sir Arthur Aston, was an English Catholic and a veteran of the Continental Wars. He commanded a garrison of around 3,000 men, a mixture of English and Irish troops, Catholic and Protestant, and was confident he could hold the town until the arrival of a relief force. The scene was now set for one of the most tragic episodes in Irish history. Cromwell's siege guns opened fire on Drogheda.
England and liberty! No popery! No popery! No bishop! No bishop! One king! King Jesus! Bow thy heads to the word of the Lord. Lord, we lay our souls in this matter at thy foot. Let us not be deceived, I humbly beseech thee. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy children against the storm. Hallelujah, brethren! Hallelujah! Watch out!
By the following day, two major breaches had been smashed in the town walls. On the 11th of September 1649, Cromwell ordered a full assault. The defenders fought bravely, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. But as parliamentary troops stormed through the breach, they fell back in disarray. Aston and his officers retreated to a fortified mound known locally as the Mill Mount, where they surrendered. But Cromwell ordered that none taken in arms be spared, and hundreds, including Aston, were butchered on the site.
Give them no quarter! Give no quarter to any man who carries arms!
In total, over 3,000 people died here at Drogheda, including most of the garrison and an indeterminate number of civilians. As many as 1,000 were killed in the vicinity of St. Peter's Church, where they had fled, seeking refuge.
Lavabo inter innocentes manus meas.
I ordered the steeple of St. Peter's Church to be fired, and one of them was heard to say, in the midst of the flames, God damn me, God confound me, I burn, I burn.
The scale of the killing at Drogheda was simply unprecedented in the context of the British and Irish wars. And by Cromwell's own account, the casualties at Drogheda included many inhabitants.
This is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. And it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future.
That is the satisfactory ground for such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret.
A lot of what happened at Drogheda, the importance that's attached to it, I think arises paradoxically from Oliver Cromwell's own attempts to explain what happened. We see a man wrestling with his conscience and winning. And it's this spectacle which any biographer and admirer of Cromwell has to confront and deal with. And I think it's that. He talks about it a lot, and he tries to explain it, and that itself betrays, I think, an uneasy conscience about what did or didn't happen during that siege.
The numbers killed, of course, are what you first note, and the fact that it's clearly civilians as well as soldiers. His justifications need to be looked at very carefully. On the one hand, rather chillingly, he says it's a just judgment of God upon those barbarous wretches that have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. So it's an act of vengeance for the massacres that have occurred years before. But it's really important we stress his second reason, which is to prevent the effusion of blood for the future. That's to say, he sees this as a way of terrorising the Irish into surrendering at his arrival. That will spare lives on both sides. It's very much the argument that the Americans used about dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and that's why the moral argument is complicated. What is obviously also complicated is why you need to do it twice. I mean, why drop the bomb on Nagasaki? Why allow the troops to run amok at Wexford?
What is unique about Drogheda is the very large number of Protestants in the garrison, and the fact that it's commanded, by and large, by Englishmen who have come over from the English Civil War and are fighting on in Ireland. And Cromwell is extraordinarily savage against these, which is why I cannot tell when Cromwell talks about the barbarous wretches in Drogheda, whether he's speaking about the native Irish and pinning Drogheda, which after all is a Protestant town, on the Irish Rebellion or vice versa, or whether he's speaking about these die-hard English who fought him right down the line, now still fighting him in another land. It is remarkable that Cromwell's greatest atrocity is against more people of his own religion and more people of his own nationality than any other engagement he fights in Ireland.
Cromwell had made an example of Drogheda, but his policy of terrorising the Irish into a quick submission would eventually backfire spectacularly. Once the initial shock had subsided, the Irish would resolve to fight on. Why surrender to a man seemingly intent on wholesale slaughter? But for the moment, it appeared that nothing could stop the onslaught of the new model army.
The sword of the Lord and Gideon!
After Drogheda, Cromwell divided his army in two, sending 5,000 men into Ulster. He himself marched south with 7,000 men. His next target, the port town of Wexford. Reports on events at Drogheda soon reached Wexford, where terrified citizens anxiously awaited news of Cromwell's advance.
Wexford is of huge strategic importance to the Irish Confederates during the 1640s because it was at Wexford, and to a lesser extent at Waterford, that the Confederate fleet of privateers, and a privateer is simply a licensed pirate, were based. They were in the North Sea, they were in the St George's Channel, they were in the Irish Sea, but above all, they were at the mouth of the Thames and in the English Channel, picking off English merchant ships. So they represented a major economic threat to Cromwell, but they also represented a very real political and military threat. His priority had to be the elimination of that Confederate navy at Wexford.
The governor of Wexford, David Sinnott, acknowledged the fear now rampant in the town.
I find no resolution of the townsmen to defend the town. To speak the truth nakedly, I find them rather inclined to capitulate than take conditions of the enemy. Such an impression they have of Drogheda.
Cromwell immediately demanded the surrender of the town, with the familiar dark threat attached.
By this offer, I hope it will clearly appear where the guilt will lie, if innocent persons should come to suffer.
Sinnott desperately stalled for time, hoping for reinforcements. For a week, he negotiated with Cromwell, sending presents of wine and beer to soften his mood. Unimpressed, Cromwell continued making preparations to storm the town. On the 11th of October, with little hope of relief, Sinnott decided to surrender. But then, disaster struck.
During negotiations, the besieging troops gain control of a castle that's immediately adjoining the town of Wexford. From that castle, they then clamber over the walls of the town, and they make their way into the town.
There are many legends associated with events in Wexford on that day, including the story of over 300 women butchered here in the Bull Ring. What we do know is that many civilians perished in running street battles through the town. In total, some 2,000 soldiers and townspeople died. Of the inhabitants, Cromwell wrote, "I believe scarce 1 in 20 can challenge any property in their houses. Most of them are run away, and many of them killed in this service."
The storming of Wexford happens while Cromwell and Cromwell's officers are in negotiation with the governor and townspeople about the surrender. And that's hard to explain away. Cromwell does so to his own satisfaction by invoking in God, divine retribution. God would have it so. But we, alas, must be less content.
That does raise the question of whether he just lost control at Wexford. It's possible he didn't want a second massacre, that one was enough, the absence of any record of Cromwell's reflections on what he did at Wexford is obviously a queasy conscience, either that he didn't want the English to meditate on a second massacre, or he didn't want to own up to the fact that he'd lost control of his men. But certainly Wexford is more problematic in a way than Drogheda.
Catholic clergy were deliberately targeted. As at Drogheda, A number were executed in cold blood.
In some ways, Cromwell is an absolutely classic Puritan. He's a Puritan in the sense that he has a hatred of idolatry, which he associates both with the Anglican Church and with the Roman Catholic Church. He hates the Catholic clergy, who he think confuse people and confuse the Catholics and keep the scriptures from them.
I meddle not with any man's conscience, but if by liberty of conscience they mean the liberty to exercise the Mass, I judge it best to use plain dealing and to let them know that where the Parliament of England have power, it will not be allowed.
Cromwell gave no specific order for the slaughter of Wexford's civilian population, but as Commander-in-Chief, he must be held responsible for the excesses of his troops.
Historians have argued that he was simply following the rules of early modern warfare, and in that sense should be excused from having the blame for the bloodlettings, especially at Drogheda and at Wexford, laid at his feet. In my opinion, there is no doubt that there was an excess used and that he abused his position and allowed his men to act with unnecessary brutality.
Despite his successes at Drogheda and Wexford, the hard fighting and harsh weather was taking its toll on the Parliamentary army. The fate of Cromwell's campaign now hung in the balance. His forces were exposed to the elements and vulnerable to a royalist counterattack. Cromwell faced the prospect of a difficult retreat to Dublin through hostile territory, unless he could cross the River Barrow, swollen by winter rains, and push on into Munster, to the Protestant-controlled towns of Cork, Youghal and Kinsale. Ormond would never have a better opportunity to avenge the crushing defeats at Drogheda and Wexford. But the great general, after 4 decades of constant campaigning, his body racked by disease, was in fact dying. Owen Roe died on the 6th of November 1649 at Clough-Uachtar Castle in County Cavan. His death was a crushing blow to the hopes of Irish Catholics.
By his death, the enemy has grown strong and cruel. For now, the enemy does not fear the name of General Owen O'Neill, which not long before did sound like a thunderbolt in his ears. As long as he breathed life, we were to stand in possession of this land. Now all is whipped and snatched out of our hands.
Owen Roe's nephew, Major General Hugh Dove O'Neill, now emerged from his shadow. Born in Spain, this veteran of the Continental Wars commanded 2,000 experienced soldiers of the Ulster Army. These troops would soon come face to face with Cromwell. The fate of Catholic Ireland rested in their hands.
Hooray! Marshal!
After the break, we conclude Cromwell, God's executioner, as Oliver's army unexpectedly begins to founder. Disease and bad weather prove to be more than a temporary setback, and the Irish start to feel victory is possible.